Hi, and welcome to VFX Tutors. In this tutorial, we'll be doing some more advanced tracking by solving this vertigo shot. Although this looks simple, a vertigo shot is a combination of dolly and zoom, so we'll have to figure out our camera movement, our camera zoom, and also create animated distortion all together to make this work. So, even though this looks quite simple, there's quite a few things that we have to do to get this to work. So first of all, I'll open 3DEqualizer. So, as usual, I'll always work in this workspace. You can change it to whatever you want. I'll just put mine on basic. So the first thing that I'll do, I'll just load in my image sequence. Just go to my camera, live action footage, and I'll go to our image sequence. And it's quite a short one. And we'll just load it in. So as usual, because this is in a linear color space, I'll change my 8-bit color conversion to... And yeah, so that's done. So what we can do now is go to playback and export our buffer compression file so we can play through the shot. It shouldn't take too long. Import it. So now if we look at this, we can see we've got lots of weird stuff going on. And we won't be able just to track this as usual because we've got lots of lens parameters that we need to solve. You can see there's my cat eating his food. So if we just play through this, it's not the most extreme vertigo shot, but we're going to start with something basic that we can easily do, or maybe we'll do a more difficult one a little bit later. So as you can see, we're kind of dollying and zooming, so there's a lot of things we have to solve for. But as usual, what we'll do first, we'll set up our lens. So if we go to lens, and you should have a data text file, and you'll have your sensor size and what lens was used. So I'm just going to fill out my film back height, 1.88mm. And so what can help you quite a lot is just by understanding what's happening in the shot as well. So I only have an 18 to 35mm. So all I can do is zoom from 18 to 35. I can't really go any further. So we can safely assume that one of our start frames is 18mm and one of our end frames is 35. You won't always get the luxury of knowing what lens you've used, but here we have to just make it a little bit easier. But this will be the same process if you don't know it, but you'll just have to figure out these start and end frames. So we've got an 18 to 35. So if we look at our first frame and our last frame, we can clearly see that our first frame is much wider. And our last frame is quite tight. So it seems to me that I started off on the 18 and ended on the 35. So we can go to our focal length. And I'm just going to put 18 in here for now. Cool. So what we can do, we can just start tracking points. In fact, let's bring in our lens grid to help us with our solve first. So if we right click, add new reference camera. If you double click on that to activate it, then do the same again, go to your browse. And if you go to data, you should have lens grids. And you have 18 and 35, but let's start off with the 18 because this is going to be, the 18 is going to have our most distortion on it. So we don't want to start with a 35 because then we'll have to create more distortion. But at least if we start with our lowest, we'll have the maximum amount of distortion in our plate straight away. So as usual, I'm just going to change my gamma to 2.2. Then I'm going to press F3 for my distortion. Then I'm just going to snap these top 3 ones in like this. And I click snap. And I'm going to fill out the rest of the lens grid by holding Control up and Control down. Control left and Control right. Cool. And Shift right to delete that. So I'm going to go Calc, calculate distortion and camera geometry, and I'm just going to leave everything as it is. Okay, calc lens parameters, and set parameters and close. So now if I select undistort, I can see how much distortion is in the plate. Cool. So we're now done with that. So if we go back to our camera and press F2, well, let's have a look at, if we press F5 and look at our distortion, because you've got not loads of distortion, but enough to make it a bit complicated. Cool, so now we can start tracking points. Let's start my first frame and just go through and just track loads of points. This is more of an advanced tutorial for lensing and stuff, so I'm not going to go through sort of tracking, 2D tracking. I'm assuming that you already know how to 2D track by now. I'm just going to go through on this and create loads of 2D tracks and get a nice spread of points. So we'll try and get everywhere we can, because we're going to be solving our focal zoom, our translations, and our animated distortion in this one. So a nice spread of points is going to really help us, whilst making sure they're quite good as well. So I'm just going to go through, just really quickly track some points. So the reason why I wanted to do something like this, because there's no tutorials on how to track vertigo shots where you're dollying and panning. So yeah, this is probably going to be the first one. It's one of those things where you have to know how to do quite a few things before attempting it, like solving animated distortion, focal zooms, and using constraints. But we're gonna do it all in one on this one because you guys wanted some more difficult ones. So this is not the most difficult, but it's going to be challenging if you've never done it before. It's going to sort of give you a good idea of actually quite a lot of things, and how to approach some things as well if you ever come across shots like this. So I'm just going to go to my windows and go to my image controls. Image controls are hidden. There we go. I'm just going to reset them. I just want to try and bring up some details on this table. Probably good enough. It's quite wobbly, so we still want to make sure our tracks are really good. Somewhere else. Cool. So we've got quite a lot of points here, but now we need something on these chairs. And luckily, I'm just going to go to my image controls, bring up the contrast a bit more so I can sort of cover up whatever's in behind there, so I can get a nice track from this. Gauge marker and track. And I'm going to do the same for the other side. Gauge marker and track. Sort of comes off there on the end, so let's bring it back and reduce our size. Cool, so we got two on our foreground. We can track up here, but it's probably not going to get very accurate tracks, and we're kind of going to need to rely on accuracy at the moment, so we want our 2D tracks to be as best as we can get. So see if we can bring up some details on this wall that we can track. Let's blur it so it's not so blurry as well. So we can get something there. Let's just turn that off. Let's select all our points and just have a look at our spread. So we've got some good foreground ones. and we've got enough on the background, I think. We can track more up here, but these are going to be our most accurate points, and we've got some foreground. Most important is going to have these foreground points. So if we just solve this and see what it does, we're going to look at this and go, wow, that looks pretty wrong. Our point cloud it's not figuring out the depth. So if we just use result and press F5, it doesn't, like, the points on first glance, it's not the worst starting point, but we can see that everything's slipping off, and our deviation browser is doing something crazy. So let's save this now. I'm just going to save it here. Cool. So because we've sort of roughly figured out our position, done our track, sorry. But if we go to F6, we can see our camera motion is really wrong. This is not right at all. That just doesn't exist, that dolly track, unless it's a roller coaster. So what I want to do, I want to go to my camera, and I want to use my camera constraints. And I'm going to select no constraint and go to line movement constraint. I'm going to press Alt-C again. So now I can see it's been forced to a linear animation. And I can see the translations of my camera is a little bit more accurate, although it's still completely wrong. So the reason why I'm putting this on our line movement constraint for now, because I don't want this to affect how we solve our focal length, because our focal length is going to be driven from probably quite a lot of our position of our camera. So we don't want it rising up or anything. But if we keep it in a linear motion, it should work quite well. So to do this, I need to go to my camera and go to my lens where it says focal length and change it to dynamic zooming. And it will default to 30mm. So we need to go to Windows and select our curve editor. So now if we go to our camera lens and curves, select our focal length and zoom, we can see our default key here. And we can select it, and we can just drag this all the way down until in the orange here it says 18. Because our first frame is our widest, so we can safely assume that it's going to be the 18mm. And we can just get it as close as possible. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, because we're going to solve for the same. We just want a good starting point. So now if we go to our last frame, we want this to be 35mm. So if we hold Control and left click, we can make a keyframe. So now we can drag this up. And now we can drag it up. I have to zoom in. Drag it up until this says 35mm, or as close to. And the reason why we're doing this is because we're doing our best guess from the knowledge that we have. Cool. So I've got 18 and 35. And I'm just going to select these. I'm going to go Edit, Set CVs to Linear, because I don't know what that curve is yet. So I'm just going to keep it as, let's imagine it's straight. It's probably not, but what we can do, I'm just going to drag this off. And if I press Alt-C now, we can see that our constraint is still on and our zoom has got a rough, but we can start to see that our depth in our points is starting to be a bit more accurate. It's starting to look like it's building a reasonable point cloud. So just use the result, and we can see our deviation is drastically lower now. But if we get Edit, also Deviation Browser, Show Point Deviation Curves and all active points, we can still see we've got lots of weird stuff. We go for our camera, we play through it. It's working reasonable for our sort of our linear best guess. So our next step now would be to go to Calc, Zoom Curve, and Calc Frame by Frame. And this is going to figure it out a little bit better. And you can see it's now given us a nice curve, and it's given us an animation curve on our focal length, driven by the camera position and the fact that we've locked it off on a constraint as well. Because if we didn't lock that off on the constraint, that will be added into the animation curve, so we just don't want that. So now if we press Alt-C, our point cloud is starting to look much better. Our deviation browser is getting lower. So yeah, it's starting to look pretty good. So we've got our camera position locked off. Well, our translations, it's on a line constraint, and we've now done our focal length zoom. One of the next things we need to do is, because as we're zooming, we're also changing the distortion. So having a static distortion value is not going to work for this. So now we need to animate the distortion. So if we go to our lens distortion curves, we can see we've got our distortion degree 2. And we can see it's static, it's got no animation on it. In fact, all of it's static, none of it's got animation on it. So we're going to focus on our distortion degree 2 and our quartic. Because if we start putting keys on here, we can start getting some interesting results. Whereas if we keep it on distortion and quartic distortion, we limit the amount of things that can go wrong, basically. So I'm just going to go to my first keyframe. I'm going to press F3, and you should have Animate Distortion here. And if you select that, that will open up this Distortion Animation tool. And all this will do is we can create keys on our distortion values on frames. So I'm just going to pull this over to the right, stop it going behind my screen. I'm going to select Key All on the first frame. I'm going to scrub all the way to the last frame, and Key All again. So I'm going to minimize that. I'm going to go back to my curve editor. So now if I view all, I can now see I've got one key here and another key here. So we can click and drag these up, but there's a better way to do it, and a more accurate that will work with our solve. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select, I'm going to make sure I've got everything deselected by holding Alt and left click. Then I'm going to select my distortion degree 2 curves. I'm going to go to Adjustment and Adjust Curve Vertices. And I'm going to leave this as it is. I'm going to select OK. And nothing's happened, because you need to now go to your parameter adjustment window. And now you should start see these scripted distortion animation curve parameters. So I'm going to put it on Adaptive All and just select Adjust. And now you can see our deviation is dropping quite rapidly. And now if we go back to our curve editor, look on our distortion, we can see it's figured it out. It's got a pretty good representation of it. If we press Alt-C and solve, press play, we can now see that our distortion is now animated. And our points, if we center our 3D point on there, we can see that's sticking pretty well already. But now we need to do our quartic. So now if we go to our parameter adjustment window, let's remove all those because we don't want to do them again. If we go to our quartic, we need to make sure we deselect these. So go back to your distortion, hold Alt and left click. So if you can't quite see that. So now we've deselected them. Select our quartic, hold Alt and left click, and we'll do the same again. We'll go to Adjustment, Adjust Curve Vertices, and select OK. So now if you go to your parameter adjustment window, select Adaptive All, clear that, select Adjust, transfer the parameters, press Alt-C now. So we've got a pretty good result. So we want to go back to our curve editor. Now we've done that, we want to do our focal length zoom again, because now we've adjusted our distortion. This is probably going to slightly change as well. So I need a calc, zoom curve, classic frame by frame. So use result. It's not changed much, but it's probably changed a tiny bit that we can't really see. So now we've done all our sort of focal length and our distortion adjustments on our camera. We now want to go back to our camera and remove this line constraint, because that's helped us figure out our zoom and our distortion, but obviously it's not going to be perfectly fixed. So we're going to go to calc, zoom curve, classic frame by frame, and we're just going to loosen up the camera and see how this works now. So now that's helped us solve quite a bit. And what we can do our distortion degree 2 again. And let's go to our parameter adjustment window and remove all. And let's add maybe some more keyframes, because our curve is quite linear and our focal length is not that linear. So our distortion is going to change along with our focal length. So we might want to add some more curves. So I'm thinking one on this sort of tangent here, and one here, and maybe one in the middle. So let's go back to F3. Okay, let's go to frame 10. Let's go on our Animate Distortion tool. And let's key all. Just going to push this to the side again so it doesn't go behind. And then go to frame 20. Key all. And 30. Key all. So now we're probably done with this. We can close this. And if we go to our curves, we can now see we've got some extra curves here. So if we make sure we deselect everything, you have to go to the, so if you've selected them here and you're in distortion and you press Alt left click to deselect, it's still going to keep these selected. So you have to go to the quartic distortion to deselect. It's quite annoying. But let's go to distortion, select all our keys, and we'll go to adjustment, adjust curve vertices, and we'll select OK. Then we'll go back to our parameter adjustment window, select adaptive, clear, and select adjust. So now our deviation is now getting lower because we're adding more values to this curve. And I know I probably should have saved it before, but make sure you save it, because sometimes this can cause a 3D to crash. So I'm just going to save. Cool, so now if we go back to our distortion degree 2, we can see it's now figured out a much nicer curve. And let's do the same for our quartic. So let's go back to our parameter adjustment, remove all, Alt left click to deselect them, the distortion degree 2. Go to our quartic, and now let's select all our quartic keys and go to adjustment, adjust curve vertices, and select OK. So now if we go to our parameter adjustment window, select adaptive all, and clear it, and select adjust. We still see we're still reducing it, but I think we're getting quite low already. When you've got stuff like translated cameras, zooms, animated distortion, you're not always going to have the best deviation. You're not going to have it absolutely perfectly low like at 0.1. It's just life. You're not going to get it exactly how you want it. But we can get it pretty good. We can get it to a point where it's unnoticeable. So I've just done those, and I'm going to go to my focal length zoom, and I'm going to do one more time on here, because we've changed our distortion quite a lot. So when we change our distortion, we need to adjust our focal length as well. Our zoom curve, sorry. So I'm going to do it a couple times, because sometimes it helps. And you can use this calculate zoom curve tool. I just prefer the older way. The older way always works really well for me. So I just stick with it. It's always worked really well. So now if I look at these curves, I can see they're quite nice. And I'm going to leave them as is. We can smooth these, but let's just have a look on our F5. Full frame this. You know, and that looks really good. If we select our points and center 3D, let's turn full frame off. We can see that they're sticking really well. So let's save this. Again, I know I'm saving it quite often, but when you're doing these sort of adjustments, you might want to save it quite regularly. And I'm going to track a few points more on this robot. Just so I can have a look at in F6. Sorry, so I'll go back to F5, sorry. I'm going to select these points, press F6. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to create, go to 3D Models, create, mesh from points, legacy. And now I've made really basic geo. So if I press F5, full frame, I can see now this is working pretty much perfectly. So we can go through and try and refine our distortion values a little bit more. Let's see what happens if we go to, if we remove all, if we view all, sometimes let's just try it and see what happens if we can get this solve, because we can add more keyframes if we want, but it starts to get a little bit heavy on the solving when you add more and more keyframes. You want to keep it quite simple, and we want it to match the curve. But what we can try if we want, we can try solving them together. This can sometimes be give you odd results, but let's just select both, adjust curve vertices and select OK. Then make sure you save it before this, because it could crash. We'll go adaptive all clear. And we'll just adjust both of our animation curves together to see if they sort of loosen each other up. Usually you'll always get good deviation from this, but you might not get a good result because you're kind of giving 3D what it wants. And it's not always the best way. You always want to make sure you're doing each bit step by step and try and not do it all at once. But if we look at these values, they're not changing a huge amount. We're talking minuscule amounts, and it seems to be helping to solve quite a bit. And we'll know if it's done anything wrong when we look at the curves, and if it's added an insanely weird curve to it, which I'm hoping it hasn't. But we'll have to wait to see. So the more you add to this, the longer it takes, basically. So you've also got to be aware of that. So now press Alt-C. Now let's look through our camera. It looks really good. I think that's worked quite well. Let's check our curves. So it's actually figured out a different curve, which may not be so good. It's figured it out, but it's very different to what it was previously. But let's just see what we're getting. We've got some pin cushioning here, which is not always great. Which could be likely because we've solved both of them together. But we'll just add a couple more tracking points to see if it causes a problem. Let's get one on this tail. So it seems absolutely fine. So, looking at this robot, if we center on our 3D, it looks pretty perfect. So we're done now. We've solved our camera animate. If we go to F6, let's just have a look at our animation. So that's probably about right. I've got a really rubbish dolly track and it doesn't really work very well. I need to get a new one basically, but it doesn't really do straight and it's quite loose. But we're looking at this and it's fairly straight. And our focal length is looking very good. So yeah, we're done. So our next step would just be to bring this. I don't think I need to bring. Well, you'd bring it into Maya and start modeling all the things, but I think I've done that quite a lot on all the shots. I think you probably already know how to do that. So I'll just leave it as this for this one. And yeah, you can go through and model all the bits. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. It's probably the first tutorial on how to solve vertigo shots. So yeah, hit that like button and subscribe for more like this.